What is going on, guys? My name is Landon. Today I am bringing you guys yet again another video, and for today's video we are talking about ESWC 2016. It's come to an end, and just as we thought, it would be Optic Gaming who ends up walking away with the title. Crim6 reaching his 4 out of 4 victories at ESWC, also reaching a milestone of a number of different events that he's acquired, reaching 26 major total victories in his career. I believe he also put it in his bio, attending 45 events. 26 out of 45 he's won, meaning at over 50% of the lands he goes to, he ends up winning those, which is just absolutely, it's an absurd stat to think about. But along with Optic Gaming winning it, in second and third and fourth, the predictions that I personally had, the predictions that the community had, were much different than we originally intended on. So let's go ahead and go over exactly what the prize pool was, maybe even talk about the event and even talk about some of the surprises that we saw, because now, as it seems, as far as Call of Duty scene goes, when it comes down to regions and comparing one to another, it seems that the EU might have potentially caught up with NA a little bit. Let's go and talk about that, though. So just regarding our top 4, we'll go and take a look at the overall prize pool, how things end up breaking down. In first place, like I said, it was Optic Gaming, who ends up walking away with $20,000 along with 2,500 Call of Duty World League points. Coming in second, it was actually Splice, who walked away with $10,000 and also 1,500 Call of Duty World League points. And third, it came Rise Nation with $6,000 overall and 1,100 Call of Duty World League points. And also in fourth place, it was Millennium, who ended up grabbing $4,000 along with that, and also 900 Call of Duty World League points. Now, I'm not going to go into super in-depth with, with the reasoning why certain things happen. I'm going to talk about maybe the major things that kind of surprised me, maybe even some of my predictions that were incorrect, maybe explain a little bit the reasons why potentially I was incorrect on certain things, and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at Group A. Pretty standard first round, I guess you could say. Take a look at the winners bracket. Optic Gaming taking out Supremacy, Millennium taking out Giants, just as we predicted. However, it comes down to the finals of the winners bracket. It was actually Millennium who ends up taking out Optic Gaming. Of course, we think about the previous matchup between both of these teams at Crown Melbourne. Optic ended up winning that one 3-1. Millennium comes out surprising. This was not the only surprise, though, that we would see. Definitely one, though, that was surprising to a lot of people. This is also a Friday matchup. Everyone knows Optic Gaming's performances on Friday don't even compare. They're a completely different team when it comes down to Friday versus Saturday, and especially Sunday as well. So with that in mind, Optic not out of the tournament, obviously. It is a double elimination kind of, in some ways, group play bracket. Bracket inside of your pool type of situation. You either lose 2, you're out, or you win 2, and you move forward. So with that in mind, obviously, Giants and Supremacy would fight off to play against the winner, or the loser, I guess you could say, excuse me, of OG and Millennium. Like we just mentioned, that would be Optic Gaming. It would be actually Supremacy who ends up beating Giants, which to me was definitely a kind of a surprising game. Personally, I didn't really know about the Supremacy roster that much. Having some previous experience watching Giants, especially coming in from Call of Duty World League Stage 1, and also into Stage 2, and also with the slow start that Supremacy has had, I really just kind of gave it to the team who I probably knew more, which probably wasn't the best idea to kind of do, but of course it would be actually Supremacy who ends up walking away with that one in Game 5, and would actually see a rematch between Optic Gaming and Supremacy, which would obviously go in Optic Gaming's favor yet again. So with that in mind, it would be Millennium escaping out of Group A with that first seed, and also Optic Gaming escaping with the second. Now moving over into Group B, something that was kind of interesting. At one time, I believe it was Millennium who was leading over Optic Gaming. It was Y6 who were, I believe, leading up 2-0 over Infused, and I believe also it might have been Killer Fish who was up over Rise Nation. Maybe that's not incorrect. There was some type of game where I was watching where Infused was involved, Millennium was involved, and some other team was involved, where the teams who you were expecting to win were actually down in a lot of the series. So there was a lot of surprise, especially I think Friday was a major kind of shock for some of these NA teams, maybe even some of the top teams in the game, especially being teams like Infused, coming from the EU, which really surprised and kind of shocked a lot of people. So we can obviously take a look at the first matchup. Infused narrowly ended up winning that game versus Y6, making that reverse sweep, which would obviously solidify their spot to verse off against Hyper Games, who ended up beating Vitality 3-0. But that's not where it would end with this rivalry between Hyper Games and Vitality. Y6 Vitality, after losing, ended up going into the losers bracket, ended up going down to a Game 5 situation where Vitality wins that one versus Y6. They obviously end up facing off against Hyper Games yet again, and this time it was Vitality. I was talking about in predictions, to kind of talk about this matchup just really quick. I was talking about, when it comes into Hyper Games versus Vitality, Vitality on the opposite end of what Hyper Games is on right now. I mean, I don't think Hyper Games has actually lost as far as the EU Call of Duty World League goes right now. I think they're like, what, 6-0, and Vitality are the exact opposite right now. Haven't even won a series yet. I was kind of talking about my predictions. I was saying, the only team that has an advantage coming into this tournament are the EU teams, but especially it is going to be Vitality for the most part, because the fans are going to be constantly rooting on those guys, rooting on Broker, rooting on Gotaga, especially the guys who they know, the guys who they watch on a consistent basis, who are in their community, they're going to be rooting for them. So regardless of Vitality's loss versus Hyper Games in the beginning, when it matters most, when it comes down to getting out of your groups, the fans were there, Vitality was turning up, and I was talking about before the tournament, Gotaga, the French monster, is he really the French monster, or is he just the monster over teams that are in his region? And that's kind of like in some ways a question to me that kind of goes on throughout this tournament, is how would Gotaga kind of perform? And he seemed to play fairly well, definitely a major factor in their victory over Hyper Games. So with that in mind, it would be Infused who end up winning this group, with that getting out of this group in the first seed, and also it would be Vitality who ended up getting out of Group B with the second one. Heading into Group C, really wasn't that many surprises. I think this is definitely probably the most standard type of groups that we end up seeing. It was Rise who ended up taking out Killer Fish. Killer Fish actually taking the Search and Destroy versus Rise. There was definitely a lot of performances that we saw from the NA, and a lot of their issues had to do with that Search and Destroy game, whether it was Optic Gaming versus Millennium, whether it was Rise versus Killer Fish, so on and so on. So there was definitely a lot of issues that we kind of saw with how talented the EU are when it came down to the Search and Destroy matches, despite, you know, Killer Fish winning that Search and Destroy, it really wouldn't matter at that point because of how talented Rise would be when it came down to the other matchups being the respawn. So with that in mind, we would also move over to Splice versus LDLC. Splice, continuing on, we talked about their placing. We'll obviously talk about that a little bit. Definitely starting off very well at this tournament, beating LDLC in a 3-0 fashion. Obviously, the two losers of this game would meet up. It would be Killer Fish going up against LDLC. Game 5 situation where Killer Fish actually beats LDLC. So kind of a surprising, I would say, I personally don't know too much about this Killer Fish roster. They did have some really good players on this team that I personally didn't really know about. I wish that I knew more about the scenes that we don't really see a whole lot about, whether it's the German scene, the Italian scene, or even the Brazilian scene. We don't really see too much coming for them, and I would love to, in some ways, be able to go to a tournament to see what teams are kind of in some ways reigning over their regions when it comes down to those. But unfortunately for LDLC, their tournament would end there, and it would be Killer Fish who end up going up against Splice, who would end up losing against Rise in a 3-1 fashion. So that means Rise would get out in the first spot, and Splice would take out Killer Fish, meaning that they would get that second one. Now for our final group, it would be obviously Group D. First match that we would have would be FaZe versus Pulse, which they would win that one in a 3-0 fashion. Epsilon and Exertus, a little bit of at least a surprise to me. Exertus ended up beating Epsilon 3-1. We talked about, and kind of, Epsilon's run throughout this tournament as well, was my major question was going to be, how does Scraps and how does Sunny B play? And it seemed that the analysis, at least from the NA side of things, not the NA, but the English stream, I guess you could say, there obviously was a French and English stream. They seem to really kind of point that out. I was really glad they mentioned that too, because I was kind of curious. They obviously know a lot more than I do when it comes down to that. But I was wondering, how these guys can perform. Like, this is in some ways their biggest tournament that they ever performed at. Would they let the French fans kind of get to them? And I was going to say too, if there was ever an event to at least be nervous about going to, where the fans would be super interactive, it would be this one. This is going to be the tournament where, constant kills are going down, the fans are getting behind you, or they're going up against you. If you're playing against Vitality, that in some ways is so big to try to face off against those guys, because you know how much that everyone wants you to lose that match. And it's just really a big deal. That pressure that you have being on LAN compared to in your own room, by yourself, talking in some ways to your friends or your teammates. It's a lot of it's a major change, I could say, when it comes down to the overall atmosphere. So with that in mind, Exertus would actually end up taking that one over Epsilon, which means that it would be FaZe facing off against Exertus in the finals to decide who gets that first spot. And of course, the two losers would be Pulse and Epsilon. Epsilon firing back, making sure that they're not going to go out without a fight, and they would end up beating Pulse in a 3-1 fashion. And it would be Exertus going up against Epsilon, because Exertus would end up losing their matchup to FaZe. Not really a surprise. It would be FaZe walking away with that one 3-0. Perfect overall in their group, 6-0 overall at map count. Exertus, a massive and an incredible series between these two, where it would go down to Game 5, and Exertus yet again would beat Epsilon. Not just once. It wasn't like a fluke. It wasn't the fact that we saw Epsilon kind of start off a little bit slow. No, we ended up seeing a matchup between these two yet again, and Exertus win this one not a 3-1, but they would win this one in a 3-2 Game 5 situation. They seem to be very clutch throughout this tournament, and they end up walking away with that one. So props to those guys. FaZe obviously walk away with the first seed, and Exertus walk away with the second one. That would move us over to our top 8 in the playoffs, of course, best of 5s, and also single elimination. I'm not really going to talk about any of the matches except for the one regarding FaZe and Splice. The first one obviously being Millennium, who ended up taking out Vitality. Optic Gaming ended up taking out Infused. Rise ended up taking out Exertus, and it would be FaZe who ended up taking on Splice, in which case it would be Splice who walk away with the victory, overtaking FaZe. Now, I want to kind of, in some ways, point out on Twitter, I was kind of being kind of dumb, to be honest with you. I was saying, wow, I cannot believe that Splice actually ended up taking out FaZe. People are like, why are you saying that's a surprise? And in some ways, I kind of complained on Twitter, and I was being like a little bit of a jerk, to be honest with you guys. I was just kind of, in some ways, kind of surprised that no one else thought that was a surprise, and I was getting like kind of weird direct messages from people saying that I was dumb for even thinking that FaZe would walk away with that victory. It wasn't really important. Either way, though, to me, regardless of what you think of FaZe right now, when it comes down to NA versus EU, and I'll be making a separate video about this, so if you guys are curious and want to hear me more talk, or just someone talk more about the NA versus EU matchup when it comes down to future tournaments and who, who's better, has the EU kind of progressed on, or was it just the tournament in general? I think definitely when it comes down to this matchup, though, FaZe has been struggling. Without a doubt, everyone knows that this is not the same FaZe coming from Advanced Warfare. People have been posting on Reddit, is this the same FaZe from AW? Obviously not. This is not the same FaZe that we are used to seeing, because why? FaZe would be, without a doubt, in the top 3 teams right now, if not in the top 2, if they were performing the exact same way they were back in Advanced Warfare. When it comes down to game to game, players and teams are going to play a lot differently. That's the thing with Optic Gaming that makes them so good, because it's not just one title for them where they start thriving. It's not because Karma was a god in Black Ops 2, they pick him up for Black Ops 3. It's not because Formal was a god in Ghost, especially coming from Halo. It wasn't Crim6 in every title. It wasn't Scump in every title. It's the fact that you have players who, over time, and that's the reason why they picked up the players that they did. That's the reason why they acquired Formal. That's the reason why they acquired Crim6. The reason why they ended up getting Karma and Nadeshot's place, because those guys are so talented when it comes down to title after title after title. It doesn't matter who makes the game; they're always going to be consistent at it. And I'm not hating or throwing anything on FaZe. I'm just saying, from what we've seen from FaZe so far, coming from an Infinity Ward game, we saw the likes of Attach rise up. We saw the likes of Zuma rise up. We've obviously heard of Glacier. We obviously especially heard from Enable kind of the end of Ghost and also toward the beginning of Advanced Warfare, how much of a storm that he can kind of provide. So I think when it comes down to overall lasting ability, it's not, like I said, not really a surprise, but it is kind of interesting to see that some teams will kind of progress on. It's also an interesting fact to kind of bring up, because FaZe is a younger team. I mean, these guys are younger players. They've been playing professionally for 2 years, especially even kind of adding in Enable. FaZe, I mean, obviously Glacier's been playing for a long time. When it comes down to these guys, they're not used to different titles. This is their first Black Ops competitive title that they've played in at a regular basis. They never played Black Ops 2 on a major competitive level. And that's something to kind of keep in mind as this roster does progress on. I'll also be talking about FaZe in a separate video. I've got a lot of videos to make here, but I don't want to talk about FaZe for too long. But it is, at least in my opinion, to see a surprise happen, not just because it was FaZe, but because it was an EU beating an NA team. When, in a sense, I would say we have the #1, the #2, and probably the #4, #5 team right now in FaZe. So to see the top team in Splice, but a newer team in Splice, take down FaZe was definitely, to me, a surprise to see, not just because of the teams who were playing, but just because of the overall regional Call of Duty that we were able to witness throughout this tournament, which I think is so good, and the reason why I loved watching this tournament, because it was our first example and our first time to see actual teams going up against one another. That wasn't Optic Gaming versus Millennium, but it was top teams from the NA, top teams from the EU going at one another, and we would finally be able to have at least some type of gauge as to where they lie on the spectrum. Is NA still the best? Basically. Is EU right there, though? Yeah, they seem, as far as this tournament goes, they seem to be right behind NA when it comes down to Call of Duty. So, with that in mind, we'll go ahead and move on to, obviously, our top 4. The semifinals would be Millennium and Optic Gaming, who would match up yet again, but this time, Optic Gaming showing up when it comes down to the semifinals, walking away with that one in a 3-0 fashion. Mill, obviously, not happy with that one, but they would not be out of the tournament. They would, in some ways, be having to face off in the 3rd place matchup, in which case, they would actually meet Rise Nation. Yes, that would not be the end for Splices. They would take down Rise Nation in a Game 5 scenario. Watch that series, guys. If you have the opportunity, go on the Twitch broadcast. Go to twitch.tv/ either Millennium TV COD or twitch.tv/ ESWC. Go to the past broadcast and watch that game between Rise and Splice. It was an incredible series. Came down to the very last game, and it was Splice who ended up walking away with this one. And we talk about constant time. It seems that the EU teams definitely have an edge when it comes down to their search and destroy game. I'm not sure if it's just overall strategies, if it's just the ability in some ways. And it's kind of funny too, because we talk about other esports, CSGO. I would say it's not called search and destroy there, but when it comes down to those round by round, one life type of game types where you have clutch situations where you need to go big, overall strategy, it seems that the NA kind of lacks. I mean, we talk about NA CSGO, we talk about NA Call of Duty. NA definitely seems to be a lot more talented when it comes down to respawns, constant killing, constant respawning, constant talking. When it comes down to a slower pace strategy, in some ways banning out, maybe even Bamber Texas where they could have won that game. It seems that EU definitely has an edge as far as this tournament goes. Now, obviously, when it comes down to future events, and I really hope we have more internationals, because when it comes down to this video, my major point is that, of course we did have issues throughout the stream and so on and so forth. When it comes down to the overall tournament, this particular match, even Splice versus Rise, this should tell you a tale and tell you something that we need to have more international events. We need to see a better gauge of where these teams lie, because it's always been NA, EU, ANZ, and then so on and so forth. Because, I mean, you can kind of throw up who you think would be in the next couple of regions. But just in general, though, we're starting to see as Black Ops 3 has kind of moved forward that, hey, the EU teams, they finally have a league now. They finally have got something. They kind of, and some ways, have a back more. They can practice against the top teams all around. We're on the exact same level. Prize money is there, teams are there, competition is at an all-time high for Europe right now, and they seem to, in some ways, be benefiting from that in a massive, massive way. They look to be, in some ways, the most dominant that they've ever looked, and I'm really, really hoping that due to this thing happening, that tournament organizers realize, hey, we need to have an international event. I heard at Anaheim they're going to have EU teams going through the open bracket. Personally, put them in the main bracket, man. Put them in the group play. Don't even let them have to go through the open bracket and stuff like that. I would love to see these EU teams play off against NA in a regular time basis. I want this to happen. I want this to be a major thing, because this is how you grow Call of Duty, man. This is how you grow regions and playing against one another, where you're not just focusing on an NA team. I just really want to see more focus, and this is an exact series why, and an exact team showing why that they should be more focused on. So with that in mind, Splice beat FaZe, they beat Rise, they face off against Optic Gaming in the finals. Before we talk about that, though, the third place matchup would go down to Game 5 between Rise and Millennium, and Rise would narrowly, at the narrowest of margins, end up walking away with that one. Pretty dominant victory, I believe, in the Search and Destroy, but I would imagine third place games, to me, aren't really the most accurate, because teams are kind of defeated. They know they're not going to be in that first place, and granted, they're fighting for prize money, they're fighting for Call of Duty World League points, they're fighting for pride, but in most cases, your pride has kind of already been destroyed at that point. Rise ended up getting that third spot, Millennium in the fourth. Who would get first and second? Of course, we already talked about it, but it would be Optic Gaming, who ended up walking away with the victory, 3-0 over Splice. Splice definitely put up a fight, though. The Search and Destroy was incredibly close. Optic narrowly ended up winning that one. Hardpoint, I mean, you're going to give Optic the hardpoint just about every time when it comes down to no matter what region you're playing against, whether it's a top NA team, whether it's even Rise Nation, or when it comes down to, regional Call of Duty, when it comes down to even EU teams, you've got to be giving them the hardpoint W, and they definitely showed up. I would definitely recommend, if you go on to, or want to at least have a little more knowledge when it comes down to this series, especially the first hardpoint, which I believe was over on Stronghold, go to Reddit, go to our COD competitive Reddit, and check out an incredible play that Scump had over in Bunker. Just absolutely destroys the definition of why Scump is the main slayer and probably one of the best players that we've ever seen in Call of Duty history, if not the best player we've ever seen in Call of Duty history. Honestly, this event was just awesome to watch. I would say maybe on Friday, a little bit of probably most of Saturday too. I mean, the stream was definitely an issue, a lot of controller issues and whatnot. Like I said, I'll definitely be making a video when it comes down to controller problems, the reason why we're having these issues, and why competitive Call of Duty is in some ways kind of put at a pause, because no one wants to make events right now, which I'm going to save that for another video. But of course, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. What is your thoughts overall on this tournament? Like I said, I know the production wasn't the best for the most part coming on Friday and Saturday, having constant issues. We weren't able to watch all of the series go down, but I mean, the French fans were on an absolute tear. Loved watching and seeing like I said, we always talk about the French fans. Are they still the best fans in the scene? I would definitely agree with that. They don't care who they're rooting for. I mean, they could root for an EU team, they could root for an NA team. Of course, they're going to root for their home team. They're rooting for Vitality. They're rooting for the EU teams. But when it comes down to major plays, I mean, they were just having a ball, and I love to see that. Massive, massive thank you to obviously ESWC for having this tournament. Thank you to everyone who was a part of it, and also thank you to the French fans who continue to show why they are the best fans in the world when it comes down to esports, especially Call of Duty. So with that in mind, guys, like I said, let me know in the comments what you guys think about all the stuff that happened. Splice's performance, do we see Rise Nation in some ways have a couple of issues when it comes down to their team? Are they still the same team that they were? Does FaZe make roster changes? I'll definitely be having a video coming out about that very shortly, probably within the next couple of days, on my opinions with that and what could come from the roster changes if they decide to make them. Because of course, roster lock does not happen, I believe, until around week 4 or 5, so they still got some time to do it. But yeah, we'll definitely be making videos about that. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Yet again, your thoughts on ESWC, put them down in the comments, and also maybe even talk about Crim's, 4 out of 4 championships when it comes down to ESWC. Absolutely incredible. Crimbot definitely showing he's not human. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Yet again, I think that's the 3rd time I've said it. Make sure to like the video if you guys did enjoy it, and also make sure to subscribe for future content. I'll see you guys all later. Have a fantastic day, and until next time, peace out.